Hello again. Okay, in this next video, what I like to do is go over this topic of supply side economics. And supply side economists are focused on how this fiscal policy would affect aggregate supply as well as aggregate demand, particularly tax cuts, how they might affect aggregate supply and what the results are. Larry Kudlow was a supply side economist who used to push supply side economics all the time. He had a TV show for a long time until he became the economic advisor for President Trump. And he advocated, most supply side economists advocate, is decreasing taxes to stimulate the economy. So if we look at this from our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, we've got this aggregate supply and aggregate demand. A decrease in taxes might increase aggregate demand, but the thinking is it might increase aggregate supply even more. So a decrease in taxes will shift this aggregate supply curve to the right, and that will increase output and actually even lower prices. So they concentrate on how it's going to affect the aggregate supply curve more than the aggregate demand curve. So for example, we decrease taxes and people will work more. They'll be willing to work more. So more people will be out in the labor force. The PPF will shift out. The long run aggregate supply curve will shift out to the right, and the short run aggregate supply curve will follow it. So now the question is, does it work? Does decreasing taxes actually stimulate the economy, either by increasing aggregate demand or increasing aggregate supply? What's the evidence? It's hard to find evidence here for it. Now, the way it's done is we would have to look back over time and say, well, are there some times when taxes were cut significantly for no other reason in particular, not because of recession, just for some political reason? And what happened? Did GDP increase? So there's a few times in the past where it's happened, and we can take a look at it. So Kennedy had some big tax cuts in the 60s, 64. Reagan had a big tax cut in 1981. Bush had some tax cuts in 2001 and 2003. Bush number one actually increased taxes in 1990. So what was the effect? I mean, if we're going to see some effect with GDP, the first thing to do would be just look at GDP over time and the growth rate of GDP and see if it changed in those years or after those years by any significant amount. That'd be the first thing to look at. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Here's GDP going back to 1945 to about 2010. And the blue line is real GDP. And this is on a logarithmic scale. So you can see on the left here, the distance from 1 to 2,000 is pretty big. It's about the same distance as the top is 10,000 to 20,000. So this has been scaled so that that blue line, if you look at the slope of that blue line, it tells you the growth rate of GDP. And that's what we'd really like to know. Not is it increasing, but what is the growth rate of GDP? Is the growth rate of GDP higher after a tax cut? Now those red lines there just show a 3% growth rate, because a 3% growth rate on a logarithmic scale will be a straight line. So if we're growing faster than 3%, then we would have a slope on the blue curve that's steeper than that red curve. And what this shows is we grow at about a 3% growth rate over time, and actually a pretty narrow band, because those two red lines are like plus or minus 3% air bands. Okay, so now let's take a look and see. Kennedy, 1964. So that is about right here. So here's 1964, Kennedy. We're going to put right about there. Reagan, 1981, so right about here. Bush, 2001 to 2003. So right about here. We can take a look at those time periods and see what happened. Oops. If we can manipulate the graphs, we can do it. Okay, so let's take a look at the blue lines during that time period. In the 60s, 64, that blue line is actually pretty steep. So you can see the blue line here has a steepness here. It's actually steeper than the red line. So it's greater than 3%. It was actually a pretty good time for growth. So the tax cuts might have worked. Although it looks like there was a pretty good growth before 64 also. But it does look like it started to increase a little bit more right after 64. So it's thought that these tax cuts in 64 had an effect on the economy. It probably did make the economy grow. Now, in 1981, what happened there? Well, it's pretty much flat there. There was not much growth at all. But then there was a recession going on at that time. A few years later, the growth was pretty good. But it may have been just because we were coming out of a recession. And the growth coming out of a recession is usually pretty good. So did the tax cuts work there? I don't know. 2001, are we seeing any better growth from the Bush tax cuts? I don't think so. What about 1990, when George, the first Bush, actually had right here is 1901, some tax increases? What happened? And it looks like, I don't know, there was a recession during that time. So here's the growth rate. It's kind of hard to see that it had any effect. Most of these, it's hard to see that it really has any kind of effect, except maybe in the 60s. The thinking is the Kennedy tax cuts might have had an effect. But at that time, the marginal rate of income tax for high earners was 91%. So that means if you're in a high earner position, that last dollar you earned, you had to pay 91 cents of tax on. Kennedy lowered that to about 65 cents or 65% marginal tax rate. So that may have been why it had such a big effect, is because taxes were so high at that time. This doesn't show the Trump tax cuts. Trump also did a tax cut, and it looks like if I was put that data out there, I was wondering at the time if it was going to work. I figured it probably wouldn't, but at least we'd have one more data point to look at. And now looking back on that tax cut that Trump had, I don't believe it really had much effect on GDP. So do tax cuts work? I don't know. Most of the time, it doesn't seem to work. Maybe it works sometimes. Still hard to say. One thing is for certain, every time there's a tax cut, I do notice big deficits occurring in the economy. So they keep the spending the same, they tax less, and they don't seem to bring in any more, or tax cuts, and they don't seem to bring any overall tax revenue in because of the increase in GDP, and they do tend to run some big deficits from it.